Hi, and welcome back to TESOL with Micky and Ide. I'm Micky, and in this episode, we are exploring mediation. So, this is the idea that learning happens through cultural tools, through practices, and through our relationships with other people. You might remember that in episode 1, we talked about how learning isn't just individual, so it's not internal only, it's also external as well. So it's about relationships with other people. It's about the culture that learning happens in. So mediation is this concept that can bring all of this to life. If you've ever taught, especially like an international group, have you ever noticed that what makes a good learner is different from one culture to the next? Some cultures interact in the classroom where they will speak quite freely, they will interrupt each other, whereas other cultures might have more of a longer turn when they speak, so they don't interrupt each other but will wait for each other to finish speaking and maybe won't volunteer but wait to be asked to contribute. Mediation, in terms of the theory from Vygotsky, can really help us to understand this. Learning is actually shaped by the norms and the expectations that we and our learners bring to the classroom. So when we're teaching, we need to be very aware of this because activities are mediated by cultural practices. So what can feel really kind of natural for one group of students or someone from a particular culture might feel the opposite for another and really less familiar. Let's use this principle to help us understand more about the zone of proximal development. So we talked about the zone of proximal development, or the ZPD, in episode 3. This is the space between what the learners can do independently and what they cannot yet do independently, but can do if we scaffold them appropriately. We also mentioned in that episode that we want the zone of proximal development to move in a particular direction. So we want to move it forward and not backwards. So if you imagine that the scaffolding which we're doing in the zone of proximal development is helpful. So we're going to do group work, and the learners are all familiar because of mediation and their past experiences and their expectations that group work will work for them. They can even have maybe some error correction from those in the group who are their peers. This is a situation where everything is working fine and the zone of proximal development is going to move in the right direction. However, imagine that that same situation is mediated completely differently, where those students come from a culture where they don't know how group work is supposed to work. They don't want to get error correction from anybody other than from you, the teacher. In this situation, it could be that the learning situation could be detrimental to them. So something to think about here, that mediation and thinking about mediation is a really important layer to put on your planning. Let's take a closer focus again then on scaffolding. So in episodes 4 and episodes 5, we talked about practical strategies and the principles of scaffolding. Scaffolding can help us in the situations such as this. If some of our learners are not familiar with group work, we can model group work for them and we can give them some support to help them get used to it. If they're from a culture where they've never done group work, how are they going to know what to do? So we can add aspects of scaffolding there, such as modeling, but also continuity there to help us. So maybe we want to do group work every day. If we can show continuity, then the students can start to absorb the structures of group work that could help them each day in the class. What's important to remember is that scaffolds can also be seen as forms of mediation. When you paraphrase something for your students, when you use a diagram, when you encourage peer feedback, you're not only supporting language learning, but you're also modeling a particular cultural way of learning. In that sense, scaffolding, like everything else we do, is not entirely neutral. It reflects a culture's assumptions about how learning should happen and how knowledge should be shared. So in our part, as the educator, as a practitioner in TESOL, we have to be very reflective and think very carefully about what we do, why we're doing it, and how easily or best that can be applied in the classroom. Let's focus then just briefly on why this really matters for the TESOL classroom. So it's important for us to recognize that mediation isn't just about teaching language. It's not only about transferring language knowledge, it's navigating cultural practices. When we think about engagement, are we going to assume that speaking up is the only way or the best way to show engagement in the class? Should we really expect students to be super comfortable straight away in groups when they have learned possibly mostly individually in their past experiences? And when our students come to our classroom, are we going to take into consideration the cultural tools that they already have? Let's think about some practical implications of this then. So the first one, I think, is awareness. We need to be aware and notice cultural expectations that might be shaping participation and not just language ability. Secondly, flexibility. Sometimes we can introduce new practices, but we also need to be adaptable and open and think that our students come with existing practices. And who are we to say that the ones which we want to implement are better than the ones which they have experienced before? Thirdly, transparency. Why don't you just tell learners why you want to do something? Tell them the benefits of it or what you think the benefits are. And jumping off the back of the last one, be flexible and allow some leeway for them. Maybe they have suggestions about how something can happen in the class. I think this is particularly important for adult learners who often need to know the purpose of why they're doing something the way that they are doing it. Finally, it's inclusion, really, isn't it? That our learners are not blank slates. They arrive with experience, they arrive with knowledge, thinking about bridging into that or bridging from that. How can we bring cultural tools and ways of learning to our classroom? Because they deserve recognition. Let's have some final reflections then. So why don't you think about your cultural expectations and how they influence the way that you teach? You could ask yourself as well, are assumptions in the classroom? If you're a multicultural class, why don't you think about the design of your lessons, and are you bringing in multicultural ways of learning? And if you are, how can you respect those? And how can you also introduce the learners to new possibilities of mediation? Okay, let's sum up. Mediation is about the cultural tools and practices that shape learning. Learning a language is not just about grammar and vocabulary. It's about ways of interacting. It's about cultural expectations. It's about the resources that learners bring with them. Across this series, we've seen how Vygotsky's theory can guide our TESOL practice step by step. We looked at social cultural theory. We looked at language as a key cultural tool for thought. We talked about the ZPD. We also talked about scaffolding. And finally, we talked about mediation, which helps us see that language learning happens with real people who come from a particular culture, and that's really important to recognize. If you like this episode, please give it a thumbs up and please subscribe to our channel. More importantly, as I always say, please share it with anybody who you think might find it helpful. Thank you so much for watching and see you soon.